Oh, yes, I can get it to work. Hooray. All right, so we're recording. Um, Let me go back to the sharing of the screen. We're on Romans chapter 4 today, and connect it with what has gone before. You'll remember that the thesis of Romans is found in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, that the gospel is the power of God for salvation to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. That Paul spends the first two chapters demonstrating that all people are under the same condemnation, the righteous judgment of God because of their sin. Gentiles who sinned against what's known about God through nature and what's understood in their conscience, and Jews who have still sinned, even though they have the benefits of the law and the great advantages of being children of Israel. They've sinned too. So the outcome is the same. All are under the just and righteous condemnation of God. So in 3 and verse 21, Paul introduces the fact that if God is going to fix that situation, it has to be something that he himself provides. And indeed, he has provided justification by faith in Jesus. And that's where he launches into the good news and provides this wonderful passage talking about the justification by faith apart from the works of the law, that both Jew and Gentile are justified by the same way. So he's been answering a series of questions that some of his Jewish opponents may have had. So verse 31, which is a really terrible place to divide the chapter, verse 31 should really go with chapter 4. Paul says, do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law. Basically, what he's saying here is this thing he's saying about how the law does not justify, but rather faith justifies. That doesn't contradict the law. In fact, the law itself talks about that. And for proof, Paul turns to a towering figure in the Old Testament history, and that is Abraham. So all of Romans chapter 4 is going to be about Abraham. And he begins, what then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. First of all, let me ask as we get started, why does Paul turn to Abraham?
He's the beginning of the whole story.
Good. At least in terms of the Jewish people, right? They felt that, and rightly so, that Abraham was their father. John chapter 8 and verse 33, when Jesus is having a conversation with the Jews, they boast that they are children of Abraham. Was their forefather. You know, we are children of Abraham was what made them feel very confident. In Luke chapter 3 and verse 8, John the Baptist responds to some Jews who had come out to the wilderness of Judea to be baptized, saying, don't brag about being children of Abraham, because the axe is laid at the root of the trees. God can raise up children to Abraham from these stones if he wanted to. But they very much in their minds boasted about the fact that as children of Abraham, they were part of God's family. So, yeah, Paul says, all right, let's take Abraham. Let's see what it is that Abraham has found. And once we figure out the way that Abraham received the promise, then we can assume that we're going to receive the promise the same kind of way. So he quotes this verse, Genesis 15 and verse 6, that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That word credited really is a financial term. It means something has been added to your account. Like, for example, back when the kids were younger, if they were fooling around and let's say one of them pushed the other and knocked a vase off the counter and smashed it, we might say, oh, you're going to have to pay that back, pay to fix that, $50. And then if they would do chores, mow the lawn or something, we might say, okay, we'll credit that to your account. You mowed the lawn, so we'll credit your account $20. That's just, you know, the way that this term works, and certainly it works the same way here as well. Abraham believed God, and God credited that to Abraham's account as righteousness. that thing that human beings need more than anything else, which is justification. And by the way, I keep saying this and I keep forgetting to make a slide of it, but the word justification and the word righteousness are basically the same word. They're almost interchangeable. They're even almost the same in Greek. When you obtain justification in God's sight, you're also obtaining righteousness in God's sight. So here's the question. I got two important questions. First of all, when was this promise or this crediting to Abraham's account in Genesis 15, in the timeline of events, when did that occur?
When Abraham believed. And I think that time would have been when he left his mother and father and started journeying in the wilderness.
Good. Close. That would be Genesis 12, but you're still on the right target. We'll go back and we'll look at Genesis 15 in a moment, but our whole discussion here is, what has Abraham found? Did he find justification in the law, or did he find justification by a different means, by faith? And obviously it's by faith, because when does the law come into the picture?
This was before the law.
Excellent, Bruce. That's absolutely right. 400 years before the law, this promise, this accrediting of righteousness was given to Abraham by his faith. So just obviously, the law and the works of the law had nothing to do with Abraham being held righteous in God's sight, because it predates the law of Moses by over 400 years. So what did Abraham find? Did he find justification by works of the law? No, the law wasn't even in existence yet. He found it through something else, and he found that through faith. So let's now go back to Genesis 15 and see what it was that he was believing, because there's a really important difference between, when we think of belief, sometimes people think of it just as a mental assent to facts, like, I believe there is a God. And that's a good start, but that's not really the kind of faith we're talking about here. The faith that we're talking about is to believe in God. Not that I believe there is a God, but I believe in God. I trust God. I know God's nature, and I'm willing to live my life accordingly. That's the kind of faith we're describing. So in Genesis 15, what's going on here? The context of this accreditation of righteousness.
That's when the angels came and said that Sarah would have a child, even though she was beyond years.
Close. We're getting closer and closer. That's certainly wrapped up in it as well, but look at chapter 15 and verse 4. Well, look at chapter 15 and verse 1, where the promise to Abraham was given in chapter 12. Years have passed, and God appears to Abraham, who's called Abram at this point, a second time, and says, I'm a shield to you, your reward shall be very great. And Abram says, yeah, about that, I've been waiting. And you've said that you're going to make of me a great nation, but I'm childless. I have no children. Eleazar, who is a servant born in his house, if Abraham dies, that's who's going to get all of his belongings, because he has no child of his own. So Abram is like, what's going on here? And so the word of the Lord in verse 4 came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir. One who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. He took him outside and said, look toward the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them. And by the way, not on a typical Central Florida hazy light pollution night, but on a calm, clear, cool, ancient night where you could see all those stars. Count the stars, so shall your descendants be. Abraham believed in the Lord, verse 6, and God reckoned it to him as righteous. So what was the specific promise? I'm drilling down on this because it really is an important point.
That Sarah would bear a child. So
Yes, actually the Sarah part of it would come in here shortly, but it's that Abraham himself would bear his own natural heir, his own child. How old was Abraham at this point? Approximately.
he was 100 when the child was born, right?
So
Correct. So he's somewhere in between about 90 to 100 years at this point, probably close to 90. And so that, that makes God's promise, what's a good adjective for it? Preposterous, ridiculous, unlikely in the extreme, to say to a man, no, I know you're 90. I know you haven't had a child yet, but I'm telling you, Abraham, you're going to have a child. And that child is going to become great. So that go outside, count the stars. That's how many your descendants are going to be. Most of us hearing a promise like that would say, whatever. That's impossible. It's not going to happen. But Abraham believed, and he believed in God. And so God credited that to his account as righteousness. So hold that thought in mind as we continue to read a little bit longer. Now, to the one who works, his wage is not credited as a favor, but what is due. I used the illustration of the kids doing chores earlier. You do a chore and you get the amount of agreed upon money. That's not what we're talking about here. To the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing on the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. And he quotes here from the second great penitential psalm. Psalm 51 is the first one. Psalm 32 is the other one. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. Guess what? That word account there in the Septuagint, in the Greek version of those scriptures, is the exact same word that we found in previous slide, credited. God does not credit to David what is due to him because David prayed for forgiveness and God covered his sins. So this is all talking about the justification that David received by the result of his faith. Verse 9, is this blessing then on the circumcised or on the uncircumcised also? For we say faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness. How was it credited? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Somebody answer that question. Uncircumcised, that is correct. When did the law of circumcision come to Abraham?
After Isaac was born.
Close. If you just flip over to Genesis 17, you will see where the promise of the circumcision is given. This is Genesis chapter 17 and verse 9 and 10. God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. So again, to put the slide back up on screen, the promise that was made, faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness. That was done in Genesis 15 and verse 6. Circumcision isn't mentioned until Genesis 17 and verses 9 and 10, some years later. So we just looked at the timeline to say the crediting of righteousness was 400 years before the law. Well, the crediting of righteousness was several years before circumcision. And so this is an important detail that ought not be lost, that when Abraham became the father of the Jewish nation, guess what? He was the uncircumcised. He was, in a manner of speaking, a Gentile. He was of the nation. And so that's a really important point that the prideful Jewish person may have kind of forgotten about, that Abraham, when he received the promise, was a Gentile in a manner of speaking. And that's really important because, again, let me pick up the reading in verse 10. How was it credited? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might become the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that righteousness might be credited to them. And now here's a really important point in verse 12. The father of circumcision to those not only who are of the circumcision, but also to those who follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised. So get this point. Let's go back to Genesis 17 again. There's something else important that happens in Genesis 17 in verses 4 and 5. As for me, behold, my covenant is with you. You will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram. Your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. That Hebrew Abram, you see that AB is the father there. Abram means exalted father. By adding an extra syllable, Abraham makes it into father of a multitude. God changes his name at this point as he's about to give him the covenant of the circumcision and says, you're not just going to be father of the Jewish people, you're going to be father of a multitude of nations. Now, one way we might look at that is that after we get several more chapters along, Abraham, after Sarah dies, actually marries another wife, Keturah, and does have other children who each become tribes and nations of their own. So a lot of the Arabic tribes trace their lineage back to Abraham. And indeed, in a physical sense, he is the father of a bunch of different nations. I don't think that that's really what God was pointing out here and what Paul is bringing out of this passage. In what spiritual sense is Abraham the father of nations?
Through Jesus, he's the father of many nations.
Yeah, I think that that is exactly right. And that the whole point of God making this promise here is that God was crediting righteousness to Abraham before the law, before circumcision, because God had it in mind to make Abraham the father, not just of the Jews, not just of those who come to God through faith while circumcised, but to also be the father of those who come to faith in God while uncircumcised, as Abraham himself was uncircumcised. So Paul's Jewish opponents really need to get this point in their minds, that Abraham is the father of the faithful. He's the father of faithful Jews, and he's the father of faithful Gentiles. He is the originator of faith being credited to one as righteousness by his faith in God. And all of us are justified in God's sight when we have the same sort of faith that Abraham had, without any reference to law or circumcision. Brian.
Although I know it's talking about spiritual things, in reality, he did actually become the father of many nations. When you go and start looking at the names of the sons of those who were born to him with his next wife, Assyria is there, Sheba, Dedan, many of the Assyrian tribes that come later on that actually take the children of Israel into captivity are from the descendants of Abraham, because
Yes.
they all moved back east, it says here. So they all moved back to where Abraham was from.
Yes, very good. That is true. In a physical sense, that's right. I think we're invited to look at this in a spiritual sense as well, but you're absolutely correct. Anybody else? Is this clear? Like when we go through it this way with the timeline in mind, this is not hard yet, is it? We got this, right? We got this.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody good? All right, super. So let's go to a new slide, and because it gets even better, and we're coming to a really important and powerful point here. Verse 13, for the promise to Abraham or to his descendants that he would be heir of the world was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is nullified. For the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, there is no violation. That last phrase is tricky, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But what's going on here in context is the promise to Abraham to become heir of the world was given 400 years before the law and years before circumcision. If people become justified in God's sight through the law, that actually is a nullification of the original promise. Let me illustrate it this way. If I go rent an apartment and I do a 3-year lease where I sign an agreement that each month I will pay $500, and in return, the landlord will provide me this apartment 23B to live in, and that's the agreement. And then 4 months into that lease, the landlord comes back to me and says, I think I let you off a little too easy. I'm going to charge you $800 a month rent. Is he allowed to do that? No, that would be a nullification of the original agreement. We have an agreement that's in place. You can't go changing it and putting different precepts on it. And that is what Paul is saying here. God made a promise to Abraham, a promise that he would become heir to the world, and justified Abraham through his faith. He's not allowed, God cannot come along 400 years later and say, you know what, I've changed my mind. I think that what we need to have is people be justified by obedience to the law of Moses. And so Abraham, all of these blessings that I have in store from you, they're going to come to pass insofar as one obeys the law of Moses. Paul says, nope, that would be changing the terms of the promise. And again, he is not in any way, shape, or form saying that the law is a bad thing. He is putting the law into its proper context and explains in other places what the law is good for and what great advantages one has when one understands the law. But the law had nothing to do with the promise or the justification that Abraham received. If so, that would really be a nullification of that original promise. And that's not fair. And God's not going to do that. So it's not those who are of law who are heirs. It's those who receive the promise who are heirs. The promise made to Abraham 400 years before the law ever came into place. And that, I think, is what helps us to understand this last statement here. Sometimes people will run a little far afield with this to say, if I don't know the rule, you can't hold me into account for breaking it. And we've already demonstrated that that's never true. If I go driving 85 miles an hour down Mammoth Grove Road and the cop pulls me over and says, you know what the speed limit is? And I say, actually, officer, no, I have no idea what the speed limit is. He's not going to say, oh, well, let me tell you, it's 45. And now that you know, from now on, let's slow her down, okay? No, he's going to write me the ticket and say, your ignorance does not excuse you. You are in violation of the law. So that's just a principle that we find not only in common sense, but other places in Scripture as well. So that's really not what Paul is meaning in verse 15, that if you don't know the law, you're off the hook. What I think Paul is saying here is, in the context, if God were to have introduced something new by bringing in the law, that would have been a violation to the original covenant. And where there is not the law of Moses, when we're just looking at the agreement he made with Abraham, then there's no violation of that original agreement. That's kind of the way that I read that there. And again, there are a bunch of different ways that you could read that. But anyway, that's the one that I think makes the most sense to me. All right, comments or questions?
And where there is no law, there is no transgression.
In other words, I would personally supply some extra words there, Bruce, and say without the law of Moses, there is no violation of the original covenant made to Abraham, is the way that I'm viewing that. I could be wrong, but that's the way that I tend to view that in its context. Brian?
So
Going
basically
back,
what he's saying then is that even before the law, we were saved by grace.
Faith, yes.
Through faith.
Mm-hmm.
Is that basically that? And that's why now in the New Testament era, we are still saved by grace through faith, because the original promise to Abraham was being saved by grace through faith, apart from the law.
That is correct. That the promise made to Abraham was, in your seed all nations will be blessed, and that Abraham is the father of those who are justified by faith, because that's how he found justification. So Jews cannot say, as they had been saying, remember back to Acts 15:1, oh, you can't be saved unless you follow the law of Moses. And Paul says that's not what Abraham found. Abraham was saved without any reference to the law at all. And that is indeed what that original promise is all about. Justification comes by faith, not by obedience to the law. That's true of Christians as well. Abraham is the father of those who are justified by faith, whether they are justified while circumcised or uncircumcised, because obedience to the law has nothing to do with it. Bruce.
So the law itself did not make us heirs.
Correct.
Because the promise was made before the law.
Correct.
And as a consequence, there could be no transgression from the law.
Well,
because the promise, our promise of faith was before the law. So our goings and comings was not based on the law, so there could be no transgression. Our heirship is strictly based on us believing what God said, the promise.
Yes, although I do want to be careful, because what happens when a person violates the law of God? Person who violates God's will, God's nature, is condemned. And when we stand before God in judgment, we will be condemned. 2 Corinthians 5:10, right? On the basis of whether a person did good or bad, obedient or disobedient. We will be held to account for our sinful actions. So I don't want to say that Christians are above the law. I don't think that's what verse 15 is teaching, but rather is saying that law, the function of law, is to do no more than identify the fact that we are sinners, and to pin us down, as Brother Stephen keeps saying, to put us in the corner, to say, you have sinned. And what we need is to be found justified in God's sight. That's not going to happen through the law or the keeping of the law, not only because the law postdated the promise by 400 years, but because the nature of the thing is different. By keeping law, that is credited to somebody's account as something they're due. What's the nature of this is it's credited to our account by faith, by simply believing in the promise that God has made and submitting ourselves to him. So I think in verse 15, the violation that's being described is the violation of the original agreement, and that won't happen. Law is not going to abrogate the first covenant. It's going to add something important to it, but it's not going to break the promise that God originally made. Brian.
I was just trying to find, there's a passage that the term used is paidagogos, and I know you probably know which one I'm talking about.
Galatians 3:24.
Yeah, the law was a tutor for us. That was the purpose of the law. I don't know.
Yep.
I don't know if that helps with this discussion or not, but
yeah. Well, later we're going to get into more what the benefits of the law really was, what purpose it does serve. Sufficient for this discussion is to remind ourselves that it does not justify. There's a lot that it does do, but what it cannot do is provide justification. That has to come on another basis, and that is on the basis of faith. So let's look at the next verse 16, because this is my favorite part of chapter 4. This is where it gets really good. For this reason, it is by faith, in order that it may be in accordance with grace, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, a father of many nations I have made you. That's what we just talked about, how Abraham is the father, not just of the Jews, but of Gentiles who have faith. In the presence of him whom he believed, even God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. In hope against hope he believed, so that he might become a father of many nations, according to that which had been spoken, so shall your descendants be. So let's ask this question to really get our minds around the quality or the kind of faith that Abraham had. I said to you before, what we're not talking about is a mere belief that God exists. That's nice, and that's a starting point, but that's not the kind of faith that Abraham had. Abraham believed in God, and he believed in God because he believed that God was certain things. What do you see in the second half of this passage that made Abraham so confident that he could believe in God to keep his promise?
You're not in Genesis, are you? You're still in Romans, right?
We're in the Romans passage on screen, but definitely making reference to Genesis 15 and 17.
Mm-hmm.
What was it that Abraham, remember, Abraham is 90 years old. He's basically as good as dead. God says, Abraham, you're going to have kids, and they're going to be as numerous as the stars. What was it about his faith in God that allowed him to say, I believe God is going to accomplish that? I think Gigi's going to answer that for us. Oh, no. Oh, Brian's going to answer that for us.
Well, he believed that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead. So because he believed that, he would also believe that God could give him children.
Good. All right. Now that scene is another powerful example of Abraham's faith. And that's a great example of the same idea, although that's not going to happen for a while yet. That's not going to happen till after the birth of Isaac and after he's old enough to carry the wood up there. That's Genesis 21, I believe, 21, 22. So that's not yet the thing, although it's really, really close. Abraham's 90 years old. He's beyond the age for having children. And God says, Abraham, you're going to have kids, and they're going to be so numerous, you're going to be the father of many nations. What was it about God's nature that Abraham understood so that he could say, wow, God, that's crazy, that's ridiculous, but I believe that you will do it? It's in verse 17 on the screen before you.
When the sun had set.
Look at the end of verse 17 of Romans 4, verse 17.
Which does not exist. Yeah. Okay.
God in whom he believed, even God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. Brian's right. This same belief is going to later lead Abraham to understand that God could, if he needed to, raise Isaac from the dead to keep his promise. But even previous to that, he still understood that God is a life-giving God, that God has the power to give life to the dead. Who's the dead one in this passage? It's Abraham. Abraham's the dead one. Abraham is beyond the time to be able to have children. And he's looking at his own dried husk of a man who's 90 years old and says, kids from this, from me? Well, God gives life to the dead. And so I believe it. I believe God can do it, and God will do it. And not only that, but he also knows that God is that which brings into being that which does not exist. He understands that God is the creator of all things, that God started from a blank canvas, and everything that we know in the world around us came to pass because God spoke it into existence. This is like that Hebrews 11 passage. By faith, Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. God created ex nihilo, out of nothing. God just calls into being that which does not exist. And when you understand who God really is, the creator, the life-giving God, that's what puts you into position to believe that God will keep his promises, and that Abraham could say, God's going to give me children. And that later Abraham could say, God promised that my descendants will be named through Isaac, and so if I sacrifice him, he's going to call him back from the dead. Or even for us to say, I believe that God is going to grant me the resurrection, even as he did for Christ. That's the hope that I have, that all of our hopes in the promises of God come back to this point, that God is the creator and that God is a life-giving God, even giving life from the very dead. So I hope you can see the just huge, monumental faith that Abraham had here. It wasn't some throwaway belief that God exists, but a true understanding of who God is, so that when he says, I will make you a father of many nations, Abraham can say, I believe it. God will do it. That's how he's the father of the faithful even today, because when God says he gives us life in Christ, that we believe it and we live our lives accordingly. All right, let me pause and ask, does that make sense? Because that's the most important part of today's lesson right there.
That's a great point. That's a great point. That just like Abraham believed that God could give life, we today have to have the same faith that God can give us spiritual life.
Yes, that is exactly the point. Absolutely. In fact, before I get Bruce's comment, I forgot I was going to put up verse 19 also to continue the thought. Without becoming weak in faith, Abraham contemplated his own body, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb, who was no spring chicken herself. So yet, with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God and being fully assured that what God had promised, he was able to perform. Therefore, it was credited to him as righteousness. So again, you can see what Abraham was believing here was that God could give life in a place where there was no expectation of life. And that's how Abraham becomes father to Christians today, because we're believing the same promise. Let me just finish the chapter. For not for his sake only was it written that it was credited to him, but for our sake also, to whom it will be credited as those who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, he who was delivered over because of our transgressions and was raised because of our justification. That obviously is going to lead us directly into chapter 5 about what it is that Jesus supplies. But so you can see the connection. Again, what did Abraham find? Even the law itself shows us that he believed, without any reference to the works of the law, that God could keep his life-giving promise. And that's how we receive justification today. When we believe that God will give us life, we believe and we live accordingly. And that has nothing to do with the law of Moses. Okay, Bruce, you had a comment there a moment ago.
Yeah, I was just reading a reference where it says Jews use the phrase gives life to the dead to refer to conversion from paganism. Also to the body of Abraham and Sarah, who were considered dead, bodies that were dead.
Yes. Yep, I think that's exactly what's going on here. Yeah, Brian.
Abraham had to have more faith than we do, because we have Jesus, who is the firstborn of the dead, where Abraham didn't have somebody to look to as somebody to follow, an example.
I think that's a good point. His faith was a very, very strong faith. We've got, the assurances that come from the historical fact of the resurrection of Jesus that gives us great strength. Abraham didn't have that benefit quite yet. That's a good point. Anybody else? All right, so our plans are to jump into chapter 5 on Wednesday night, but not so quickly, because I don't intend to go past the first 11 verses on Wednesday night. We're going to slow down our pace. It'll probably take us 3 sessions to get through Romans chapter 5 is my guess. So I think Romans 1, 2, 3, and 4 were all, easy to do in the span of a whole session, but chapter 5 demands that we slow down and talk more carefully about each paragraph. So that is the plan. If you'll read Romans 1 through 5 in preparation for Wednesday night. Yes, Bruce?
In verse 14, which says, for if those who depend on the law are heirs. So for those who said, I'm an heir because I'm of the law, then it's saying then faith was no good.
Well, notice the word if at the beginning of verse 14. If those who are of the law are heirs,
Or
faith
heirs, right?
is void. Right.
Right.
So what
So
he's saying is if Jews obtain the inheritance, if Jews obtain justification by the law, well, then in that case, faith is void. And the promise that God made to Abraham 400 years before the law is nullified because he's changing the specifics, right? And he's not allowed to do that.
well, mine says, for if those who depend on the law are heirs.
Mhm.
So if I'm depending on the law to be an heir of Abraham,
Mhm.
then my faith is of no value because the promise is worthless. Because I depended,
that's correct. Yeah.
because I depended strictly on the law itself to count myself as an heir.
I think you're correct.
Okay. All right. Did many of the, I guess, did all of the Jews depend on the law to consider themselves heir of Abraham?
Well, mostly as a whole, the Jews and their leaders and their teachers believed that none of the Gentiles would be saved because they don't keep the law of Moses. Remember in Acts 15 and verse 1, there were even Jewish Christians coming around to various Gentile churches saying, whoa, you got to start keeping the Sabbath and being circumcised if you want to be saved. And so the Jewish understanding, generally speaking, was that if you don't keep the law of Moses, then you will not be saved. And what Paul is laboring to teach is that was not what Abraham experienced. That's not the basis of us receiving salvation. That's not to say that the law is evil or meaningless. Paul will go on to say very good things about the purpose of the law, but its purpose is not to justify. So there may have been a handful of individuals amongst the Jews who understood that God loved the Gentiles also. I think that there are little bits and pieces of that are clear. But you'll remember in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus goes to the synagogue and he preaches the gospel, initially the people are just falling over themselves to praise Jesus. Wow, what wonderful words are falling from his lips. We've never heard anything like this before. This is amazing. This is great.
Right.
In the middle of the sermon, Jesus points out two Gentiles in the Old Testament who receive God's blessing, Naaman the Syrian and the widow of Zarephath. And all of a sudden, his audience flips 180 degrees from being, wow, this is the greatest sermon ever, to get out of here, we're going to kill you. And they drove him from the cliff so that they could throw him off. So the Jews just hated the idea of Gentile salvation. Now, you could become a Jew through the proselyte process, but in that case, you were circumcised and you began to obey the law of Moses. And so you were no longer a Gentile at that point, you were now a Jew. So in the main, Jews understood that nobody outside of the law of Moses could be saved. So Paul's saying that the blessing of the Christ is available to those who are Gentiles without any reference to the law at all. And that everybody, Jew and Gentile alike, receives salvation, justification by faith, a faith like Abraham's. So good stuff, everybody.
One question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Back in Genesis, as part of the promise, God told Abraham that his heirs, or I guess descendants, would occupy a certain land.
Yes.
And that they would move around for so many years, and they would come back to this land even after his death. So is there a difference in the idea of descendants and the idea of heirs?
No, I don't think so. You're right that there was a three-part promise given to Abraham in Genesis 12. One was the land, one was the nation, and the other was the singular seed through whom all nations would be blessed. So if you trace those different promises, they were all granted, and you can actually see where they come to pass, not in Abraham's lifetime, because Genesis 15 says you're going to die, and you will go to your fathers in peace, but to your descendants I will give this land. And you can read, I think 1 Kings 4:21 is one example, that the full extent of the land was given to the people. They did inherit the land that God promised. The nation promise was fulfilled in Exodus, I think, chapter 24, where they all gathered around Mount Sinai, where the animals were slain, the blood was sprinkled on the book, and the people entered into a covenant relationship with God, and they became God's own covenant people. So the land promise and the nation promise were both fulfilled. And then the seed promise is fulfilled in the person of Jesus when he comes and provides blessings for all people. So all the promises were fulfilled. And we Gentiles obtain our salvation in Christ today because those three promises were fulfilled. We're looking for a land, a heavenly land. Here I come.
Okay.
Got it? All right. So I have a lunch date that I have to now keep.
All right.
Having lunch with some